Good morning, students. Welcome to 12 Arts. I, Mrs. Manali, will be taking your classes for political sciences. So, in these difficult times, let's make the effort to continue with your studies. Now, in 12th standard, you have two books for political science: World Politics, that is contemporary world politics, and Indian politics, that is politics in India since independence. So, few instructions before we start. Most importantly, download your books if you don't have them. Do the questions that will be given to you at the end of every chapter. Now, maps and cartoons are very important in political science, and I will be explaining you each one of them at the end of every chapter. So, let's get started. Now, in 11th standard, you studied the concepts of political science, the ideas of political science. Here in 12th standard, you will study various events of the history of politics, where you can understand them, analyze them as you go through it. So, your first chapter is the Cold War era. Now, what is war? War is usually defined as a state of armed conflict between the countries or different groups within a country. Now, there are use of weapons, there are violence, there are use of arms, and all these are basically characterized when you talk about war. So, this chapter basically provides a backdrop to the entire book, as the end of Cold War is seen as the beginning of the contemporary era in the world politics. Now, we all know that the world has faced two world wars by far: World War I, 1914 to 1918, and World War II, that is 1939 to 1945. World War I, we had Allied powers, Britain, France, Russia, US as the winners, and Central powers were Germany, Austria, Hungary, who lost it. The Second World War, the winners were France, UK, US, and the Soviet Union, whereas the loser was Germany. Now, amongst the winners, there's a difference that came up. France, UK, US were parts of western side, whereas Soviet Union was in the eastern side. And this end of the Second World War led to the rise of two major centers of power, one in the east, that is the Soviet Union, and the other in the west, that is the US. And then further, you will study about NAM as a challenge to these two superpowers, and finally, India's role during this Cold War politics. Here we'll also discuss how India is still analyzed for its stand on non-aligned movement, that is NAM. So let's come up directly on one of the most important events of the Cold War, that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, Cuba is a small island country which lies in North America. In 1961, the leaders of Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, were worried that United States of America would invade Cuba, headed by Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro, one of the most famous politicians ever. And if you're updated with the news, he passed away very recently in 2016. Now, Cuba at that point of time was an ally of Soviet Union ruled by Nikita Khrushchev. In 1961, due to the fear of US attacking Cuba, USSR decided to convert Cuba into a Russian base. And these and the installation of these weapons put US for the first time under fire from a close range, which nearly doubled the number of bases or cities in the American mainland. The US President John F. Kennedy sat in tension thinking about that Russian base that was established in Cuba. He was reluctant to do anything that might lead to a full-scale nuclear war between the two countries because they have just come up from the Second World War. And both of these countries were equal winners. But Kennedy was determined to get Khrushchev to remove the missiles and the nuclear weapons from Cuba, and therefore he ordered the American warships to intercept any Soviet ships which is heading towards Cuba as a way to warn USSR of its seriousness. And that crisis came to be known as Cuban Missile Crisis. And this crisis was a high point of what originated the real context of the Cold War between US and USSR. So what is this Cold War? Now, before heading towards this, let's understand the figure here. This picture over here, where you can see Cuba hiding itself from Soviet Union at one side and USA on the other side. And you can understand the dilemma that was there between these three, which actually was between these two, US and Soviet Union. They framed Cuba in such a way that this whole event came to be known as Cuban Missile Crisis. So what is Cold War? Cold War is a series of tension, confrontation between United States and Soviet Union. It is not just a matter of power rivalries or military alliances. It was a real ideological conflict. So what was that ideology? That ideology, which was headed by West, that is US, was represented by the ideology of liberal democracy and capitalism, whereas the Eastern Alliance was headed by Soviet Union and it was committed to the ideology of socialism and communism. Now here, let me explain those ideologies. Liberal democracy means a democratic system of government where individual rights and freedoms are protected and political power is governed, is limited by the rule of law. Capitalism, the next ideology of US, here means of production are privately owned. Now let's come to USSR. The ideology of communism talks about common ownership of production, whereas socialism is where government owns the means of production. So these two ideologies of both the sides was the reason the Cold War took place. They wanted their ideology to take a global popularity, global stand. And finally, this Cold War continued between the two countries. So what was the context which preceded these events? The end of the Second World War is a landmark in the contemporary world politics because the Allied forces, which was led by US in 1945, defeated the Axis powers led by Germany, Italy and Japan. And this war had involved all the major powers of the world. It spread out to the regions outside Europe. It devastated the human lives, civilian property, and marked the beginning of another Cold War. Now it ended with United States dropping bombs on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Now what was the need of Japan bombings? If we talk about the environment, if we talk about the critiques who have talked about United States dropping bombs, they said that Japan was already there to surrender in the Second World War. But still US chose to drop the bombs. What was the need? The need was such that it wanted to stop the Soviet Union from making any military and political gains in the Asia, and basically to show Moscow that United States was supreme. Why Moscow? Because the Battle of Moscow was another high point in the Second World War. And Moscow being one of the most famous cities of the Soviet Union. US supporters also said that the dropping of atomic bombs was necessary to end the war quickly and to stop the further loss of American and the Allied powers. So basically, the consequence of the end of the Second World War gave rise to two new powers on the global stage. With the defeat of Germany and Japan and many other parts of the world, US and Soviet Union became finally the greatest powers in the world to have the ability to influence anywhere on earth, basically. So your question should be defeat of Germany and Japan. How did that happen? Now, defeat of Germany, basically, USSR approached the German capital of Berlin from the eastern side and Western allies coming from the western side. Now, knowing this, that defeat was imminent, another controversial leaders of all the times, Adolf Hitler, committed suicide, and Soviet finally conquered Berlin. So that is how the whole war took place. And finally, you see the rise and the emergence of two new powers on the world stage, that is US and USSR. But why did US and USSR did not go for a full-fledged war? And here I present you with the logic of deterrence. What was this logic of deterrence that actually stopped them? It is such that here both the rival powers, they have the capacity to retaliate against an attack. They have the capacity to do so much destruction that neither of them could afford to even initiate the war. They are in possession of all the nuclear weapons of inflicting death and destruction, which is unacceptable to each other. And in spite of provocations, neither side would go for a war because no political gains would justify the destruction of their societies. It will be impossible to declare one side or the other as a winner. And that is why they decide to prevent the war but continue with the rivalry. So I leave you here with the logic of deterrence. We'll continue with the same topic in the next class, in the next video that I'll be presenting to you. Till then, you understand the whole video and the questions will be given to you in another PDF file. Go through it, do them. If you find any problem, tell me, and stay safe, stay sanitized. Thank you, everybody.